I think it's a really important societal change where we are able to recognize there are certain differences between men and women with ADHD, and in particular, women who are diagnosed late in life, like me. I got diagnosed in my late 40s in parallel with perimenopause when the symptoms got worse.
Hi, I'm Jo Clark, and thanks so much for joining me today. This is the Redefining Midlife podcast, a podcast designed for the 40-plus woman who is determined to challenge society's myths and beliefs around midlife. It's for the woman who is inspired and ready to define midlife her way. Join me each week as I chat to health and wellness experts for up-to-date information on how to live well as some special conversations with incredible everyday women redefining what midlife can look like. Here's to making our next half of life even better than the first. Welcome to episode 115 of the Redefining Midlife podcast, and the second of a series of episodes covering neurodiversity in midlife. With increasing rates of diagnoses and new insights into the brain, this is a topic that we really should learn more about because it may impact you or someone you know. And this podcast is just all about supporting women to live their best lives. Now, last week we heard from clinical psychologist Kirsten Bowes on the topic of ADHD in midlife, how it presents differently in women to men, and why more and more women are being diagnosed with ADHD during the menopause transition. If you missed that one, I suggest you go back to the previous episode to catch up. Otherwise, listen to it at the end of this episode. In today's chat, I'm talking with past guest Natalie Yan-Chatonsky and her personal experience of being diagnosed in midlife with ADHD, what that's meant for her, how her life has changed. And she also shares more about the cultural stigma her diagnosis has had as an Asian Australian woman. I'm so very thankful for Natalie as she offers so many insights, perspectives, and challenges as a neurodivergent midlife woman living in today's world. And she's also recommended some really helpful resources, and you can find those in the show notes. Now, remember, if you think that the information could help someone else, please share the episode with them. And without further ado, let's welcome Natalie to the podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, Nat.
Hi, Jo. Thank you so much for having me back.
It's an absolute privilege. And what you're going to be sharing today is going to be so important for women to hear, because you're going to be talking about your own personal experience of ADHD. Your story is going to help women in lots of different ways. So even if you and the listener is not formally identified or diagnosed with an ADHD diagnosis, at least they'll have an insight into what that's like for somebody, particularly a woman in the middle of life. And you sharing your story may actually even lead other women to seek a diagnosis. And we can never underestimate or ever know that ripple effect of someone's brave sharing like yours is going to have on another person. So thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure. And it's been a few years since I got diagnosed, and I've been on such a journey. So even if people have just recently been diagnosed or have someone close to them who've been diagnosed, I think it's a really important societal change where we are able to recognize there are certain differences between men and women with ADHD, and in particular, women who are diagnosed late in life, like me. I got diagnosed in my late 40s in parallel with perimenopause when the symptoms got worse. So that was when I really started to feel that something wasn't quite right, and learnt a lot about the symptoms of ADHD in women. And then hence that led to the actual diagnosis a couple of years ago with a psychiatrist.
So was it just a nagging feeling, Nat, that you had?
No, actually, it was a very specific set of circumstances that really took me on this massive roller coaster ride of becoming formally diagnosed 2 years ago. It was around the first year of the lockdowns in Sydney, during the pandemic, when there was a lot of things that had changed in my life. For example, normally I would go into the office and be surrounded by my colleagues, and I get a lot of energy from being around my colleagues when I'm working on a project. And the other thing that was different was that I wasn't doing any of my usual exercise of swimming in the morning, going and doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I've been doing for the last 10 years or so. So all those sorts of structures that I always had in place that I now know are actually incredibly helpful for helping me my productivity focus and also physical and mental well-being, all those things being stripped away. And on top of that, having quite a stressful client project and a very, very stressed out client who was also dealing with his own anxiety around the loss of control over his staff because he couldn't see them. For him, it was the first time to manage a team. So it was a combination of all these different things all coming together. And now that I look back, I was also in perimenopausal phase. So I kind of had an inkling of that, but the symptoms for perimenopause have changed over the last few years. So I suspect it was a combination of lifestyle reasons as well as the stage in life and also what was happening in work that all happened all in the same year that made me think totally incompetent in a job that I've been doing for a very long time. The actual project work should have been quite easy, but the administrative tasks that I had to do that were part of the job were incredibly difficult for me to do and motivate myself to do. And I just couldn't understand what was happening. And then I started to do a lot of reading of understanding not just about ADHD, but specifically women and women who haven't been diagnosed till later in life. And then secondly, the intersectionality with the fact that I have a Asian background. My parents migrated from Hong Kong to Australia and I was born here, but there's still some stigma attached to certain things that are related to things that I guess that involve therapy, just to put it at that. So whether it is neurodivergence or it's getting some support for mental health, both of which are incredibly important and have helped me a lot over the last 2 years of then being able to change the stories in my head about myself and then be able to really focus on the things that are my superpower and link it to the work that I now do. So I think it's so important to really have that understanding of myself so that I can do the big work that I'm now working on now as a result of being liberated from, I guess, not knowing previously what I thought was wrong with me.
So looking at that then, I'm interested to know if you do look back and look back on your younger self, are there moments of behaviors and things that you can see that earlier in life that is making more sense for you now? And if so, what are some of those?
Part of the diagnosis with a psychiatrist is that I had to go and have a look at all my past school reports. And fortunately, I had them all filed away. And when I was looking through them consistently, there was this really, I guess, each report, year after year, would show, some things I was just excelling at, was really enthusiastic and getting really top marks. Then other subjects and comments from teachers, I'll be told that disengaged, daydreaming, I wasn't trying very hard or chatting too much and totally distracted. So it was this weird kind of mishmash of different behavior all in the same person, but consistently with, my whole childhood and of being a student. So at the time, I guess there wasn't any knowledge in seeing that pattern. We now look back at that, and that was evidence just that almost in itself for my psychiatrist to see, oh, right, this is something that I've always had those traits of having a combination of hyper focus, but then also being a dreamer and can get distracted and go down rabbit warrens of information that I might be very interested in, but not so interested in certain things. And that's why things like doing admin are really difficult for me to do.
Gotcha. Okay. And when you actually received that formal diagnosis from your specialist, what were the initial feelings? Was it one of relief that, oh my God, thankfully I've got something, or was it one of, oh no, what is that going to mean for me?
I was so relieved because it's a long journey to get diagnosed. Like it was a series of appointments stretched over about a 5 or 6 month period. So in the lead up to the beginning of getting that diagnosis, I'd done a lot of research myself. So I'd self-diagnosed, but then there was always at the back of my head during that period before the actual formal diagnosis, have I just made this up? Am I just trying to apply a label to myself as a way of, giving some meaning to why I didn't quite fit in certain situations, or why certain things have been difficult for me that are easy for other people. So in that lead up to that final appointment when I actually got the diagnosis, it was quite nerve-wracking. I thought I had it, but just you never know. And then when she told me, it was this big relief. Yes.
So then 2 years after, or a couple of years after your diagnosis now, how has your understanding of ADHD evolved, and has it changed the way you perceive yourself and neurodivergence? Because you've just hinted at that then.
I am really proud of the fact that I've got these very specific superpowers that I can share with the world. It's made me a lot more confident about myself, and also knowing how to set my boundaries. So if I know there's certain parts of a project or a piece of work that is not my strength, I'll find people to work with or ways to overcome that so that it doesn't drag me down and drain my energy. So it means that I am always following where my hyper focus and sense of purpose will lead me. And that eventually leads me to connect with people who are very aligned with the type of work and the social difference that we want to make together. So it's reinforced how important social connections and having the right people with different skill sets from my own are really important for me to do, make a really big national difference with the innovation work that I do.
Do you look back now and see, like at the time it was just all of these things happening at once for you prior to having your formal diagnosis? Do you see that almost like a gift now? That had that hadn't happened, perhaps you would not have gone through what you did and therefore pursued it like you have in order to find out what you've got.
Exactly. I think it's an absolute gift to have had that formal diagnosis just before I turned 50, to then now be really flourishing in my early 50s. And I've got decades now to really do the best work that I can do from now on. So, yeah, if I hadn't been diagnosed, I wouldn't have had the medication that I'm now on, which helps me do the tasks that I find really difficult. And then secondly, the rewiring of some of the negative stories that have built up in my head around my weaknesses have now been replaced with really positive stories of things that have been great in terms of my own capability being acknowledged, and things that I'm really proud of that have come about over the last few years since the diagnosis, that has come about because of I guess, my confidence in putting myself out there for opportunities previously I wouldn't have gone and pursued, or the self-doubt had stopped me from going forward. And then also being really clear, what am I good at, and sticking to my lane and moving forward just on that track, and not getting distracted by things that might be practical but actually won't necessarily leverage everything I've got to offer or my purpose.
That really, when you're explaining it like that, that puts you in a distinct advantage compared to ordinary everyday people, doesn't it? Really, when we could all improve in those areas, knowing what our strengths are, knowing what our weaknesses are, and working towards them. But you are fine tuning it now and really
Yeah,
diving in, aren't you?
yeah. And look, even before the diagnosis, I'd been doing so much research into how do you lead a life in the second half of your life for a woman to thrive. I'd gone to some of the blue zones. I've done all this longevity economy research. So it started to really click together for me when I kind of realized that importance of not trying to do everything, but really sticking to those two things, as you say, that area that you've really got some expertise around, you're really passionate about. It gives you that sense of purpose, and where are your strengths that other people value you and basically be able to pay you the top dollar to be able to do the work that you're best at is unique to your skill set
Mm.
and will enable you to thrive on a day-to-day basis, and therefore over the course of a lifetime will really light you up and be a gift not just for yourself but for others as well.
Yes. So have you, I'm just interested to find out as well from you from a perspective, because you're a highly accomplished woman. You're exceptionally intelligent. Did you also have a gifted diagnosis as well? Like, have you? Because a number of people who are on the have been identified, not diagnosis, because you're not diagnosed with gifted, but identified as gifted. Sometimes there is twice exceptionalities involved with that.
I think I'm of the generation where they didn't even have that at school.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I really learnt more about gifted and talented children when my son, who's now 18, was going through school. So I actually don't know. I think when I look back at school, it wasn't really my favorite phase of life because I was doing a lot of masking.
Mm.
So I think there was a bit of cultural shame as well as my perception of myself of not being like everyone else. I think back to that education that I had, and the school environment's very different, say, from my son's generation and the school that he goes to, which is very accepting of the whole of person. I think that sort of quite closed environment during those formative years definitely helped me sharpen a skill that isn't really great in terms of being a people pleaser and also masking who I really was.
Mm.
So I'm trying to shake a lot of that off,
Yes.
knowing it's not healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned since your ADHD diagnosis?
Biggest lessons would be that just because I've got a brain that operates in the way it does is one way of behaving and thinking and operating in the world and doing things. It's given me a lot of insight into why it's important for workplaces and employers to enable and I guess really give people the opportunity to bring all those differences together, because that's where collectively, if everyone feels like they can do their best work and stick to what their strengths are, and we've got a common purpose, that's when you can actually all thrive because you're doing stuff that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do by yourself. So
Mm.
even though I'm a sole trader, run my own business, the power of collaboration has been incredibly important over the last couple of years in realizing, no, I don't necessarily need to feel like I'm an expert in every aspect of running a business. I can work with people who actually quite like the things that I don't like doing. And they might respect and acknowledge that the things that I really like doing, like working in the fuzzy front end of product development or ideation around a big complex social problem, I love that. And if I can work with people who are super organized, are very linear, process oriented, can think about the risks, we make a really great combination.
Yeah. Yeah. Has it changed your relationship with friends, family, your husband, your son? Has that changed since your diagnosis?
Yeah, I've been able to put words around why I behave and think in a certain way when interacting with my husband, who is the counter to me in many ways. And we've always acknowledged that we're totally opposite in the way we work and think, that we complement each other. But now I'm able to explain, well, the reason why I was feeling really emotional and fearful of that situation is this concept of rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is called RSD. And it kind of helps put some, I guess, it helps explain that this is a symptom of the way my brain works, and there are strategies to overcome it. So, an example would be when we've talked about business development and sales. Now, that is not my strength, and RSD is something that can be quite debilitating in many aspects of your life. And when it comes to sales or reaching out to someone, you already start to imagine this negative story of them rejecting you because they haven't responded to you, or they might have not liked something about a proposal, things that you can take very personally. Being able to just help the people around me understand that just because I haven't replied back to my husband's email about something that I'm actually excited about, like a holiday, it's just because, well, I'm probably not sure about, what is the right response, and I'm overwhelmed with a whole lot of work things. It's nothing personal. So I don't use it as an excuse, but over time, I think I've helped him understand how he can work with me to overcome some of the things that I find difficult. So the result of him understanding, for me, sales is not a numbers game. It is more about really quality conversations with the right people who I feel like I can support, make a difference for. I don't want to just randomly go out to a whole lot of people, spam them, and then do a whole lot of sales and waste people's time and my time, and also drain my energy. So let's shut him down on a few things that we previously disagreed on. And then I just keep him posted. Look, this is yet another positive result as a result of me really leaning into how I can do things in a way that works for me.
Yeah, yeah. And so, Nat, how do you balance those demands of midlife, like career, family, still got a son at school, with managing your ADHD symptoms?
So the reason why I skipped your question around, have I needed to talk to my son about my ADHD? I think because at school it's so normal. So the school generation talk about it a lot. It's very common at school. He's got a lot of friends who've got a form of neurodiversity. They're very open and accepting. So he actually often coaches me, actually, because he knows what works for his friends. So it's actually been very helpful to have someone who's younger, more informed, and very comfortable talking about it. So when I think back to why is it so easy to, I guess, run a household and have, a son who's doing the HSC, but he's actually not needing a lot of support from me. I think it's because over the course of my lifetime as a mum, I have instinctively known that I'm not like a lot of other mums. And I've tried to teach him from a very young age to be self-sufficient. So like from a very young age, when he was a baby, I always had the attitude that I really want my child to grow up being able to do as much for himself as possible and be able to stand up for himself and not have to rely too much on other people to do things for him. And so I think as a result of kind of setting the expectations that you may or may not be able to rely on me to pack your lunch every morning, because I'm not a morning person, I'm an evening person. Teaching him, look, you might want to just make your own sandwiches if you want to have lunch at school.
Yeah.
He learnt that from a very young age, to not have to rely on me, and he's fine with that. It's a bonus if I do remember to pack lunch for him, and it's not like I am totally I guess unable to do those domestic duties, but I guess it's just being very explicit with family members that I can be a bit patchy when it comes to doing household chores for others in the family.
Yeah.
And so I guess maybe I learnt that skill of identifying and kind of communicating to others around me who are really relying on me on certain things. Don't rely on me. Equally, from the time I moved in with my husband, I made it really clear, don't rely on me to do your ironing. And so he's never needed to get me to do his ironing for him. So I think that's actually a good thing.
That's a win. That's a big win.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier on your experience of having an Asian background. So you're an Asian Australian woman. How has that, and with your parents, you mentioned that, that there's a bit of a stigma with a whole neurodivergence or mental health, and seeking assistance there. So how have you navigated all of that, Nat?
It's not spoken about in my family that I have ADHD. So I guess my way of dealing with that is really having deep empathy with people who are hiding a part of themselves.
Yeah. So you
So
just knew not to mention it at all. That was just a
they know about it, but
okay.
they don't want to talk about it.
Gotcha.
So I don't want to push it. I've found my own way of getting the support that I need. And, the last couple of years has been a very intense period of rewiring my brain with more positive stories and achieving a lot and moving forward. So it's been less important to get the approval and that old pattern of people pleasing and pleasing my
Yes.
parents, of really doing what was right for me in order to thrive and therefore be able to care for them as they go into older age. So I think it's okay of not necessarily having to feel like everyone has to know all the ins and outs of the detail if they aren't ready to acknowledge and to make it a normal thing in the family. But it does drive me to be an advocate for neurodiversity in society around the conversation and the awareness of what it is, how it's different for everyone. It can be supported, you can be supported through dealing with some of the symptoms as long as you've got the supportive networks around you. It may or may not be your life partner or family members.
Yes. And so we know then statistically there's more people being diagnosed later in life. Why is it so important not to be dismissive when someone shares that they've been diagnosed with ADHD, particularly as an adult in this stage of life?
It is so confronting if you open up by telling someone that you've been diagnosed with ADHD and that person, whether it's a stranger or a friend, then makes a joke out of it like, oh, everyone's got ADHD. I think I've got ADHD. Or ADHD is being overdiagnosed. Like, I've received any one of those comments, in a typical month. And I often hear about women who get told that, or, those comments are thrown at them and they've just shut down and don't want to talk about it. And so I think it's really dangerous
Mm.
that we revert back to masking, because if we don't talk about it, because there are negatives, but there's also, as I've said, real positives that everyone benefits from. So if we don't talk about it, we'll constantly have the same issues of misunderstanding, or the perception that someone is not reliable or they're always late and not really understanding. Well, actually, there's ways around to ensure that that doesn't happen. I've learned so much in terms of different productivity hacks, and I now know how to make sure that I will, do the things that I promised to do. And that's only because I've learned to set those boundaries, have talked to the people around me. I'm quite upfront with new teams or project teams that I work with. This is who I am. And often they will then come forward and share certain things about them that is good for me to know about them. And, it just ensures that everyone in a team or organization can really truly show all their vulnerabilities and really be able to support each other through certain periods where maybe things like tasks or a stay in a project can be quite difficult.
Mm. What are some of those productivity hacks that you were talking about? What are some of the things that you've found has really helped you?
There's a few of them. I think having accountability buddies or body doubling is really great. So I learnt this quite early in my self-diagnosis, how helpful it was. So years ago, I signed up to a site called FocusMate, which is a digital version of body doubling. And it's inexpensive, but that taught me the power of being paired up with someone who is also working on a task, and you set what the intention is for that period of work so that you stay focused. Just knowing that someone else is working on something that they're committed to working on at the same time is really helpful. So that was really my first kind of foray into trying it, really small dosages. And I've since then set up lots of different accountability groups, one for my writing, one for my professional speaking, and one for running my business, because I know that if I just rely on myself to go and find the opportunities or to improve on my professional growth, I won't get very far. But by knowing that I've committed to certain deadlines to others, I will definitely achieve it. So no one else benefits but me, but I know that works really well for me. And then when it comes to overcoming the time blindness, it is also just understanding how to break down a big project or a big overwhelming task into the smallest possible pieces. And in this age of generative AI, this is where it's really helpful to be able to put in the situation that you're in terms of, well, I need to get XYZ done. How should I sequence it? How do I time box it into my diary? Help me break it down. So that's very helpful to have a very linear thing like a bot that
Yeah.
has been given the input on how to structure the little pieces of work that will lead to the end outcome. Because I think my superpower is understanding the end vision and where do I want to be with a project, and what are all the different assets and outputs, and how do I bring everyone else on the journey. But the bit where I sometimes need some support is if, in the absence of like a project manager who's super organized, who can schedule the stuff, and sometimes I have the luxury of a project manager to work with me side by side on big client projects. But for some of the things related to my business, I don't have someone I can speak to any time of the day. So it's very handy to use generative AI in a way that really helps you. And obviously, you can always reject things that looks unrealistic, but it's knowing how to put in the prompts and your own requirements around the time that you've got available and the task that you've set for yourself.
Brilliant. Again, because we're talking about this ADHD a lot more, neurodivergency a lot more. What are some of the misconceptions that people might have around about ADHD and midlife, and ones that perhaps you've encountered and you would like to address?
So one of the misconceptions is around laziness and not being reliable. And I think that can come about because, in my experience, there's a lot of perfectionism, because my whole life I've been trying to be a people pleaser and also trying to overcompensate in my abilities. So constantly trying to go above and beyond what is expected of me so that I'm not seen negatively. So so on the surface level, it looks like I'm a really high achiever, but that comes at a cost of constant burnout. So there's this thing called ADHD burnout, where like every few months you just crash and just have to sleep for days on end to recover. And therefore it's just understanding that it's really important to pace yourself and not overcommit. And you know things are very doable if you're in the right role and you're committing to the things that aren't draining, because it will be generative in terms of energy, new opportunities that align with your skill set where you can get those paid opportunities. So if it's managed in the right way, you can overcome the guilt and the shame associated with the, I guess, fear of being seen as not being reliable or lazy. So I think this is why I think the diagnosis and then being informed on what are the productivity hacks and communicating that clearly to others so it's not seen as being negative is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. And because you've been on the show before, Nat, I've asked you the usual wrap-up questions that I have. So I've got two different ones for you in context for what we're talking about today. What advice would you offer to other midlife women who might be wondering if ADHD could be a factor in their lives?
I would say go and do a whole lot of research so that by the time you go and talk to your GP as a first port of call, at least you're informed on why you might suspect you've got ADHD. I think that was very helpful. And I think just finding out about ADHD in women and if there is some intersectional diversity, like myself, in terms of having a different cultural background or different identity, it's helpful to also understand the research that is out there about intersectionality and how it can impact you from a mental health perspective. Because if you then go and see a health practitioner who then actually, if they aren't informed, at least well, actually, I've got to find someone who does have some up-to-date knowledge in this area, as well as the intersectionality with menopause, because that's very important in understanding that maybe you got through certain parts of your life with being able to just get through and manage it, but where it gets difficult is when the symptoms get worse. And look, I'm constantly still learning as well. I am, very interested in how I can get better and how can I explain it to other people as well. And I think it's a really fascinating topic in terms of how people's brains are so different, and therefore the behavior over the course of a lifetime can either set ourselves up for success or it can be extremely damaging. And I really care about ensuring that more people are informed, whether they have it or not. It's useful for everyone to realize that it's not always a bad thing to understand how your brain works. For me, it's like discovering what my manual to my brain is. And, thank goodness I found it just a couple of years ago, because now that I read my manual back to front, I can really test the boundaries and see how far I can go.
Yeah, that's right. You've got decades of fine tuning.
Yeah,
And there's
exactly.
so much more research coming out now and what we're learning about the brain. So, it's exciting for people who probably are diagnosed at this stage of life, because there's so much more that we are going to be learning. You've got all of these tools for your toolkit now. So, yeah. Thank you, Nat, so much for coming on again today to talk to us about this, because having someone's perspective, understanding more from what it's like from a lived experience is really, truly important. So thank you for your honesty, for coming on and just sharing the nuts and bolts, which isn't easy for anyone to do about something, in particular on how their brain works and how they're different from each other. So I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to share my story, Jo.
Absolute pleasure, and we'll catch up soon. Thanks so much for listening and sharing your time with me today. I'd love you to hit subscribe on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app to keep spreading these empowering messages. Please share this podcast with other incredible midlife women in your world. Join me again next week for another redefining midlife conversation. Thanks again for tuning in.